I wouldn't say there were many like epiphany moments. There weren't many beautiful, glorious moments, but there were some really little ones that were enough to carry us. And I've always sort of termed those as like the diamonds in the dust. It was a really dusty terrain, but we had a few diamonds. There weren't many, but there were a few. And one I remember is I actually was standing at our kitchen mirror in our home in Woodstock, and I remember this really clearly. It's not particularly exciting, but I'll just share it for anyone who's listening and looking for a diamond in the dust. And I had my hands on my face and I was really up close to the mirror. I'd been crying and I just looked at myself and I was just like, who am I if I'm not going to be a mummy? Who is this? Who is this face? Like this tear-stained face, these lines of worry I can see coming in my skin. And I was looking at my eyes and I was looking at my skin and I was looking into my soul, I suppose. And I was just like, I don't know who I am if I'm not going to be able to have to say I'm a mum. I was so lost, and I just heard, was it the audible voice of the Lord or was it in my heart? I don't know. But I heard that thing I've actually already referenced, so I've given the spoiler, but I heard the Lord say, Sarah, I came to give you a hope and a future. I promise you a hope and a future. I haven't promised you a hope and a baby. And I was like, it was changing for me, because although it didn't give me an answer or a promise, which is what you always want, it gave me something.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Lead podcast with me, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, in partnership with Advocate Collective, an organisation that supports public advocacy for the Christian faith and provides support for professional therapy to survivors of abuse, church hurt, violence or persecution. The podcast is a place for deep engagement with extraordinary guests reflecting on life and leadership, wins and challenges along the way. And it was all inspired by the book Lead Like the Real You, which I wrote for women with that question in mind. What would it have been helpful to know 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago that no one tells you about or talks about? And this week we're diving into a deeply personal and painful subject for a lot of women, the subject of fertility. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sarah Lang. Sarah has been married to her husband Andy for 18 years, and they absolutely love living in the rural Oxfordshire countryside. You gorgeous people around the world, just imagine those hobbit-like rolling hills. She works as a registered nurse, and she's done that for over 20 years. But Sarah's also been involved in many different forms of church leadership and has been a regular radio guest, published columnist and speaker on a variety of platforms. Sarah and Andy are the founders of The Rhythm of Hope, an amazing ministry which seeks to encourage and equip Christian couples who are experiencing infertility. Welcome, Sarah.
Oh, hi, Amy. Thank you so much for inviting me.
What
a privilege.
No, honestly,
what a privilege.
So great to have
and
you
it's
on.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm honestly incredibly grateful. You and I have known each other since you came to Oxford to study nursing all those years ago when you were, I think, 19 and ended up joining the youth team, the church that we were leading in. And I've loved you ever since those days. You've been an amazing friend. So as we just begin together, can you share a little bit with our listeners about your life and career so far, just to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Well, 25 years, Amy, I did the maths, 25 years of friendship shared with you, which is and Frog, which is just wonderful, and so many brilliant memories of our time together, leading youth ministry primarily, but also worship, lots of laughter and fun, and lots of shared meaningful times. I was thinking of our wedding day, but also special events in your life. It's just been wonderful. So mutual admiration society over here. But so as Amy said, sort of going back a little bit, I was actually born in Edinburgh. So I was born in Edinburgh, lived there till I was about 6, and then my parents relocated to the Cotswolds. where I did the rest of my growing up. I was brought up in a Christian family. I'd say I really found sort of my own faith in Jesus for myself, and that became really my own sort of relationship with God when I was about 14. So that was an exciting time, a really exciting time. At the time, it was sort of 1994, and there was a lot happening around the world and in the UK with a fresh outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and that's where I encountered the Lord for myself. So I went to university at the age of 19. I'd had a gap year, done a discipleship training school, and then came to Oxford, where I met you and Frog. And by then I was, 19, hopefully full of the Holy Spirit and definitely feeling excited for uni. And I just... I went there to do my nurse training. I trained as a paediatric nurse. And then in the years ahead, I basically loved Oxford and the city, the people, the church that we were in. And I stayed. I worked part-time as a nurse and part-time as actually the youth pastor for the church for many years, and did other forms of sort of youth ministry and worship-based things. But then over the years, I met and then married Andy, my husband. And as you say, we've been married for 18 years this year. So we've remained in Oxfordshire, and it's been great. That's the potted history of me, but
wonderful. Okay, thank you, Sarah. So to be upfront with our listeners, I've already mentioned fertility, but I just want to give a tiny bit of a trigger warning, because this is just a massive issue for so many women, but also men as well, of course. We're going to be talking about infertility, and that is such a painful thing for so many people. And I'm conscious of those who are currently trying for a baby, and for women who are, who are listening to this and who are single, not by choice, and so who are experiencing a form of unwanted infertility. Can you just start by sharing with us what infertility actually is?
Yeah, of course. Because sometimes I think if it's not been part of your story, or a story of a loved one or a friend, you're not quite sure really what you're dealing with. So yes, medically speaking, infertility is the inability for a couple to achieve pregnancy, or to conceive within a 12-month period. That's how it would be sort of diagnosed. So after 12 months of trying to conceive, if a couple have been unable to achieve pregnancy, they would be diagnosed with infertility. And that can come in many different sort of forms and have many different reasons. But usually it's a problem with either the male or female reproductive system in some way. At times it can be unexplained though, and there's no reason given. That statistically, they say worldwide, that actually affects 1 in 6 couples. So this affects millions of people.
Right.
It's a 1 in 6. Yeah. And you're quite right in terms of those who are single, not by choice. They too are facing perhaps what I've sort of always sort of called an unwanted childlessness, or childless not by choice. And so again, that's an incredibly painful situation and journey for many men and women who had dreamt of a different sort of picture, and it has many of the same triggers and issues attached to it, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. So would you be willing to share some of your story with this, Sarah? It's so incredibly generous to be vulnerable about any area of life, actually, but I think about this area in particular. But it would be incredibly meaningful if you would share both your experience and your wisdom with others. I know it will mean a lot to people who are experiencing something similar, or supporting people who are experiencing something similar.
Of course. Yeah, totally. I mean, for almost 16 years, this has been a very big part of my own life, and stories was something I never spoke about. And yet now here we are, and I am more than happy to sort of bear all, really, because if nothing else, it helps people feel a bit less alone. And of course, it equips and enables the church and the wider sort of family and friends of those who might be walking this path to just have a bit of insight. So I'm really happy to share a bit of our story. For me, it became clear around the age of 18, my mum spoke to me about a strong family history on my maternal side of infertility. And this was something she had held herself and worried about. She herself had experienced secondary infertility. So that was after I was born. She was unable to have more children. That's a story of many couples. And there were other close sort of female family members who had primary and secondary infertility as well. And so she took me to a doctor at the age of 18 to discuss these things. I was very single, very Christian, and very young. The doctor couldn't predict the future, really, but he agreed it was a cause for concern. And his advice, really, in that consulting room that day was to go and find some good sperm and get those eggs fertilized, which was quite a sort of unexpected turn of events. I'm not sure it's what my mum had anticipated in the direction of that consultation with her 18-year-old Christian daughter who's single, being told to go forth and multiply. I think she was just a bit like, oh, we came out, my mum, she went, oh gosh, like this. It was really, gosh, that's a lot to talk about in the car. Yes, I know. It was in her sort of fox fur or whatever she was wearing. Faux fox fur, maybe I should say. So there ensued for me quite a long period between that consultation at the age of 18 and actually me getting married at 26. There's already an 8-year wait of, I first need it, right, we need to take the gas off here. We need to not rush. We need to not worry. Finding the right husband that God has chosen for me and the right man for my future, whether we do or don't grow our family with children, is imperative. And I am not going to rush just to kind of do that whole egg meets sperm thing. So there was a wait, there was a pullback, there was an uncertainty, and I think there was worry straight away for me. I began to worry, and I'm sure my parents were worried too. When I did meet Andy and we started dating, I was very upfront about this situation. For every story is unique. For us, there was a little caveat that Andy had been previously married and had a daughter from that marriage, which is a whole other story. And so in many respects, that was a huge relief and blessing for me that he, even before we talked engagement or long-term commitment, I knew he already had the title of daddy and I knew he'd already had a child. And so it wasn't something I felt I was withholding from him or stopping him doing. And I know many couples, there's this feeling of sort of guilt and shame, and maybe my husband or wife would be better off with someone else who can give them what they want. And that's very, very difficult. For our story, that wasn't part of it, but it definitely was a big factor, which is why I share it. And Andy was incredibly gracious and incredibly faith-filled and very joyful, and thankfully still wanted to be with me. We still continued then dating more serious. Well, some would run a mile. And, he's pretty Pentecostal, Andy. So he was just like, if the Lord wants us to have children, so we'll have children. He was very confident. And that did rub off on me a little bit. So we got married. We actually held back trying to conceive just for a while to enjoy our early married life. We didn't jump straight into it, but we didn't really delay either. And we did sort of embark upon trying. And unfortunately, it became really clear within a year that this was going to be something we would be struggling with. And we went back for further testing, further diagnosis, and it was confirmed that I was in that position that my family members had been in. So whilst it wasn't a shock, I've got to say it was something we'd hoped would never have actually come our way. And I think we were so hope-filled and so full of faith that this wasn't going to be our story, that I was actually still quite shocked that it was, and so disappointed. And And there ensued 13 years of our married life, trying and waiting to grow our family with a baby of Andy's and mine. And whilst I had the joy of parenting Andy's daughter Chloe, and she was and is a beloved daughter to me, I still longed and yearned to experience pregnancy and to carry a baby and to birth a baby. And it was just, I know not all women have this feeling, but it was just in my very blood. I yearned, I longed and I yearned for it. So 13 years of waiting for anything, not just children, but whatever if you're in a season of waiting, I think 13 years of waiting for something is a really long time, and it takes all your energy and all your focus and all your faith. And it's just there, whether it's right here in front of your eyes or whether it's just somewhere here, it's always there. And there was there was 13 years married. It was actually 20 years since I sat in that first consultant's office at the age of 18. It was 20 years of this sort of here, right behind my sternum, just this ache and this burn and this breaking and this pulling and this sort of anxiety really about it all that never went away. And what I would say is, and I know you'll like this, Frog will like this as well, that my GP was called Dr. Hope. Okay. And my consultant was called Dr. Child. Okay. So I've got to say, the penties in us were like, this is in the bag. Like, spiritually speaking, this is a done deal. The Lord is just going to do something so wonderful here, and we're just here to see it. Like, I'm here for it. Do you know what I mean? And we had a lot of faith, a lot of confidence. And I think I was a bit cocky, actually, in a way. Like, before the Lord, I was like, I just know you've so got this. And we enjoyed the baby making, if you know what I mean. And it all was kind of a bit like a test of we're just going to put this before the Lord and be like, this is going to be okay. And then over the course of the years ahead, it really wasn't okay. And it really wasn't happening. And it wasn't in the bag at all. And there were no guarantees. And what I would say is that infertility has a very unique form of grief. Most griefs that we experience and move through in our life get better over the course of time. And I've heard other couples say the same, that infertility appears, feels, and is worse over the course of time. It's a grief that gets worse because you're watching everyone's lives progress, everyone's children grow. It's not just the pregnancy announcements, it's then the baby showers, then they're born, then it's the first days at school pictures, or it's the this or it's the that. And even for our parents' generation, they're missing out on becoming grandparents. It's just something that over time is magnified because everyone's lives are moving ahead at this pace, and you feel so lonely and so left behind. And it also, if it's not been part of your journey, I would love to just point out it affects everything, because decisions you would make over the job you're going to take, or the house you might rent or buy, how many bedrooms will you need, the car you might buy, does it need to have space for a car seat or a pushchair, the holidays you might book, can we book that holiday, or might I be pregnant by then? I mean, this was a nightmare for me, poor Andy. I just could hardly book anything because I was like, well, I definitely think this month is the month. And if you book that holiday, I'll be like 8 months pregnant and wouldn't be allowed to travel. You can't make plans in your career.
Any plans.
Or just your adulting. So on it goes. So it changed our outlook. It changes your friendships. It changes your family relationships. It infiltrates, of course, your marriage, your intimacy, your sex life. That's inevitable, because suddenly your intimacy and your lovemaking becomes this issue of baby making versus intimacy, and you have to sort of
orientated in
right.
Some way.
You have to sort of navigate that. We have great tips for that, by the way, but there's a lot of shame attached, and it can feel quite unjust. And I would say, as Christians, and this is going to sound a bit counterintuitive, but stick with me, I feel like infertility is worse for Christians because with it comes, and I don't mean that disrespectfully to the Lord at all, because I will expand how he was with us in this season, but with it comes all these additional layers of like, what are your feelings about healing and about miracles and about God's sort of sovereignty and about
and children as a blessing in some ways.
I
There's
know.
in the Old Testament connected to abundance and righteousness, and
exactly. So why is that
It's
being
can be really
withheld? And it's confusing and it feels unjust. And you see terrible stories in the news or through my work as a pediatric nurse, awful nursing families through terrible situations of maybe child abuse or things like that, and thinking, why have they been given children and I haven't? I would look after my babies. Do you know what I mean? So on and on, 13 years of a monthly, don't forget, this is like every 4 weeks. Oh, this is definitely our time. And then, oh, it's not our time. And then the grief, and then the picking yourself back up again. How many negative pregnancy tests we looked at, how many times I would scrutinize my body, So that was our story for 13 years. And Proverbs 13 has this verse that says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And for us, that our hearts were sick. They were so sick. They were so sad. I was so sad, even though I know how to be joyful and I know how to still keep going. The sadness was otherworldly and the uncertainty was otherworldly. And I think one thing that's really validating I want to share is a study that we came across. Actually, it was a real light bulb moment for Andy in particular, who was phenomenal through this. And I have to say, and we were sharing actually at an event last night about our story, and he did say there, this was never my diagnosis. He never said, Sarah has been diagnosed with infertility. Sarah has infertility. Sarah can't have children. I heard him when we did start speaking about it. It was we are walking the road of infertility. We aren't able to have children. We are struggling with infertility, which, by the way, was such a game changer for sort of bringing it as us, you are one. I realize if you're childless, not by choice, maybe through being single or whatever, that's a different type of language, but it's still, the language we use is very important in this. And I think not using kind of barren or kind of all the negative connotations attached with it is something that's really helpful in speaking ourselves out of that shame. But we came across a study where some scientists, there aren't many, but some scientists had done research into the stress response of someone who's diagnosed with infertility. They took physiological markers from saliva, blood samples, blood pressure, that kind of thing, sweat. And the outcome of the study was that somebody diagnosed with infertility had the same physiological stress response as someone who was diagnosed with terminal cancer or HIV. And I remember Andy reeling, and I remember him sitting down and he said, I'm sorry you feel so awful. And I was like, this is it. This is why I sometimes can't pick myself up the floor. And we share that study with so many couples because it validates the pain and the stress.
Sarah, will you share that with me? Because I'd love to put that in the show notes.
Yes,
so people engaging with
yes,
this
I will.
could
So
access that.
there's not much out there, but that was a little morsel. So, what I'm not going to...
And that's a truth. That's a truth that's already true.
Yes.
Your stress response is happening but you're being given a validation, it's like another diagnosis of incredibly serious stress.
Yes.
That's
and
in
that's
your body already.
Exactly.
And you know it. So when you read it, it sort of resonates.
Exactly.
Wow.
So look, to fast forward, of course, there's the trenches where we were at for all those 13 years. And it's a roller coaster. We went through periods of great faith and periods of, is this ever going to happen? We prayed, we fasted, we did the organic diets, we tried doctors, we tried this, we tried that. And what I would say is, and this is just so cheesy, but it's incredibly true, is that yes, our doctor was Dr. Hope, and yes, our consultant was Dr. Child. Ultimately, I think by the end of the 13 years of married trying, we realized there was really only one name that we could ever sort of throw ourselves at. And we just had to come back to the name of Jesus because, it says in Jeremiah, I'll give you a hope. I'm here to give you a hope and a future. Unfortunately, for those trying to conceive, it doesn't say I'm here to give you a hope and a baby in arms. but it is a hope and a future. And we actually had got to a place where we had drawn, and this is something I would recommend to any couple who are struggling to conceive, particularly over a long period of time, or someone who has unwanted childlessness and has a lot of open avenues and doors. Maybe they're considering adopting a child or going through some fertility treatment to have a baby by themselves. But at some point, there has to be an end point. I think this isn't a season you can live in indefinitely. Now, sometimes age dictates that, of course, but we weren't willing to sort of wait that long. So I'd already done like a 20-year journey. We'd done 13 years in our marriage. And for me, we decided that by my 39th birthday, that year of my 39th year, we would stop. And that was to preserve our mental health, our marriage, our spiritual health, our well-being, our joy, and to start planning new thoughts and new hopes and dreams for the future, which is really important, which didn't have children in them for us as a couple. Obviously, we had Chloe in our family. And so we had set a boundary line, and I think that's really, really helpful for some couples. The reason the 39th year, in case you just like you're into attention for detail, most people would say they'd stop when they're 40, and I just didn't want my 40th to be this year of grief. Like, I wanted 40 to be a new beginning of a new decade. I'd 18 to sort of 39. I'd gone through late teens, 20s and 30s carrying this. It wasn't welcome in my 40s. And so that was why I said, a 39, it's not an even number, but it was protecting my 40th decade. I actually gave birth to our son when I was 38. So the Lord he knew. We did have fertility treatment. We received fertility treatment. It was a gift. It was offered to us unexpectedly from a clinic who'd made some mistakes in my care in the year previous, who'd evaluated my file and my case, who called me in for a debrief, which I didn't want to go to. And I was so depressed and miserable and sad. But Andy quite liked closure, and he was like, I really want to go and tell them how terribly handled it was. And he had a complaint sort of ready. You want to put your pain somewhere. And we sat down, and I just said, I'm not going to be saying anything. I'd cried and cried for so many months prior to that. And I'd actually had a round of treatment and lost a twin embryo transfer. And I was just devastated. And as a side note, someone had unhelpfully prophesied we would have twins. And so I thought that round of treatment was the sort of golden ticket. And
was it?
So we went, and then they offered us free of charge a second go with their heartfelt apologies, really, for some errors that had been made. And I was so conflicted. We didn't know whether to take up the offer or not. And we actually talked to my parents about it, because I'm quite regimented with my rules. And we'd said that round of treatment was going to be our only one. And I'm a bit legalistic like that. But I was like, are we going back on like this deal we've made with the Lord, or what? Should we just take it? That was a no. But my dad just said something really simple. He's a profound man, but this was quite simple yet profound. And he just said, I said, what do you think? What do you think? Do you think we would be sinning? Like, I was so worried. And he said, I think it sounds like a gift, Sarah. I think it sounds like you're being handed a gift. And actually that was it. And so we did that round of treatment. We didn't have the WhatsApp prayer group going. We didn't have everyone sort of blowing their trumpets around the walls and all the things we'd had before. We'd gone full out Penty on the first round, and then this was very quiet and very zero hope in my heart, actually. Very low key, really guarding myself. And to my shock, it was successful. So, and then our son Ezra was born as a result of that gift. So what that's gift. The context of
amazing, Sarah. So thank you so much for sharing that story. And I really, really appreciate that because sometimes when we talk about this, it's all about the happy ending. It was all fine in the end, but actually you've really dug into, that 20 years and specifically 13 years of pain, and you know what it's like every time Christmas comes around, or every time a birthday comes around, every kind of marker of another year without a baby. It's so hard. And you talked quite a lot about you talked about the Lord and how that, you know, a little bit about how that impacted your journey. Could we dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Would you be willing to sort of share more deeply about how infertility impacted that faith journey, and how you and Andy both responded, I guess, in your walk with the Lord, and, you know, held on to faith even in the darkest times?
Absolutely. Because whilst our story will encourage many, it also, I'm very aware it can wound to hear that when you're trying and waiting for children, or when your child is not by choice, to hear someone else has got the child can be really painful, actually, and not all that helpful. So whilst I long that our story will encourage and bring hope, we primarily want to focus on how Jesus met with us, because actually that is the hope that we were holding on to. And remember, we had decided to stop. We had decided we'd reached a place where, you know, and it took a very, very long time to say, even if not, he is still good. That was the kind of the place we wanted to get to. Even if not, he's never a plan B God. He's not a God of second best. He's not a God of the consolation prize. Okay. We don't just go out and get a puppy and sort of roll our proverbial eyes. He is never that God of second best. And so with all confidence, we can say to couples who are waiting, or single people who are waiting to see how their story unfolds, don't forget, he's never the God of second best. He doesn't tardy with his promises. He's not late. He doesn't drop the ball. He is just full of the very best for our lives, whatever that looks like. And so to dig in a bit more to the faith side of things, I want to say for Andy and I, again, this is really unique and personal. We never got stuck or struggled with whether God could heal me physically. I know that is difficult for some people, and that is a journey you have to go on. For us, we didn't. You know, we're always asked this, but no, we didn't struggle with whether God could. But the main sticking point for me and for us in our faith was, would he? And that's a very different question. And I don't know if you remember, Amy, because I'm not sure you will remember, but you met with me after my diagnosis at New Wine, actually. I met with you in a sort of leaders' lounge. I just received the diagnosis. I was down there speaking for a youth event. You were leading a venue. And you prayed with me, with one of the guest sort of speakers that year. But something you said to me as we departed, you said to me so gently, you said, you know, God's miracles are his to give and they're not ours to take. And that was actually something that stayed with me the whole time. And as I was prepping, I was like, I wonder if she remembers saying that, because I remember you saying that. I didn't write it down.
He said it to me.
Okay. So
obviously
I should have had some tissues next to me. Oh, wiping my nose. Yeah. So, oh dear. Right. I have to lean over for the Kleenex in a minute. So it was never a could he for us. Though I know many need to dig deep into this whole sort of issue of healing, but it was, would he? And there's a quote that says, not a spiritual quote, but I think it's from a film. It says, I don't mind the pain or even the despair, but it's the hope that kills me. And actually, hope became the problem, because we had not our hope in Jesus, that came later, but hope for children and hope for a miracle and hope for healing came later. And actually, though we longed and hoped that God would work a miracle in my body, he didn't. He didn't physically change my diagnosis. We did pursue fertility treatment, yes, and we were blessed through science and by the grace of God and by doctors with Ezra. But what we began to see is how and we see this in the couples we walk alongside as well. When you're talking about miracles, the miracles of God actually come in many, many different shapes and sizes and in many guises in that whole story of infertility that don't just look like a baby in arms or a swollen belly. And when I'm counseling and now talking to the couples who actually have decided like we had to stop, who say this is enough, we're done. For the sake of our finances, for the sake of our faith, for the sake of our marriage, for the sake of our futures, we are done. When I see how God changes the hearts of couples who take that courageous step to step away into something else, it's actually miraculous, Or when I see the family who go to meet their adoptive children for the first time and they bring them home, and I see the joy that unfolds and the miracle of belonging for that child who needed a home. It's a beautiful thing. So I suppose what's happened to us in a faith perspective is we've begun to see the Lord and the way he works and the way he comes alongside and the way he moves so personally to us, so deeply, profoundly, and so perfectly in ways that we could have never begun to experience had we not gone through this fire of infertility. I don't think I would know Jesus as I know Jesus now had I not had those 20 years. Now, of course, I've heard people say this through their experiences of illness or maybe cancer or bereavement. The Lord will come and he will come to us in the most magnificent ways on what you call the holy ground of suffering. He does. He always comes like he promises. But I am grateful that through the lens of infertility, I could begin to see God in a way that I wouldn't have ordinarily seen. Now, how did that work? Well, there weren't many. I wouldn't say, I'll just be honest, I wouldn't say there were many like epiphany moments. There weren't many beautiful, glorious moments, but there were some really little ones that were enough to carry us. And I've always sort of termed those as like the diamonds in the dust. It was a really dusty terrain, but we had a few diamonds. There weren't many, but there were a few. And one I remember is I actually was standing at our kitchen mirror in our home in Woodstock. And I remember this really clearly. It's not particularly exciting, but I'll just share it for anyone who's listening and looking for a diamond in the dust. And I had my hands on my face and I was really up close to the mirror. I'd been crying and I just looked at myself and I was just like, who am I if I'm not going to be a mummy? Who is this? Who is this face? Like this tear-stained face, these lines of worry I can see coming in my skin. And I was looking at my eyes and I was looking at my skin and I was looking into my soul, I suppose. And I was just like, I don't know who I am if I'm not going to be able to have to say I'm a mum. I was so lost and I just heard, was it the audible voice of the Lord or was it in my heart? I don't know. But I heard that thing I've actually already referenced. So I've given the spoiler, but I heard the Lord say, Sarah, I came to give you a hope and a future. I promise you a hope and a future. I haven't promised you a hope and a baby. And I was like, it was changing for me because although it didn't give me an answer or a promise, which is what you always want, it gave me something.
Yeah.
And there were little diamonds in the dust along the way where the Lord would speak to us and he would encourage us. If you were to ask how we managed faith in that time, I think there's a lot to be said for positioning and posturing yourself to meet with and hear from God, even if you don't. Going to church, just get your bottom in the seat. Put on the worship playlist in the background when you're cleaning or when you're stress cleaning or when you're doing jobs or when you're driving your car. Even if you don't sing along, worship music I find is so full of biblical truth. Even if you haven't got the heart or the energy or know where to start with the pages of your Bible, good worship music is full of biblical truth and it just infiltrates as you listen to it.
Carries you somehow.
It does. So position yourself, posture yourself to hear, listen to the podcast sermon, go to the service, be around inspiring Christian friends. They might not necessarily bring anything that day, but they also might, you know. So it was that just being there. Did I leave church disappointed sometimes? Yes, I did. Did I leave healing meetings disappointed? I did, because I always went thinking today's the day. You know, in the ministry times at church, I was like, bring a prophecy, bring a word, Lord. Would the speaker at this big conference single me out and say something? You know, I was just desperate, and I was there. Did it happen? No, not really. But there were times where we just received the comfort and the peace and the presence and the companionship of God, and we wouldn't have had we been running in the opposite direction. So that definitely was really important, was just to be there. For us, like, this, just over the years, there was just this knowledge that the Lord, you know, that God is the author and perfecter of our faith and of our story. And I was always really aware that he would be weaving his gold in what I'd known of God previously. He'd never let us down previously. He'd never disappointed. His track record was great. So we had something to go on. And I just knew he was the author and perfecter, that he was weaving gold, that it was, I couldn't see what the threads looked like in the story, but I knew because I had experienced and fallen in love with a beautiful Jesus, that the story was still being written, and it would be glorious and it would be beautiful. I just knew. It took years. It wasn't immediate. But the more I got to know Jesus, the more I loved his beauty and his presence and his goodness in our lives and his sovereignty, actually, and what that really means. I didn't know the future, but I knew he wasn't going to drop us. And I knew he wasn't that God of second best, or, you know, the consolation prize. There's actually I'm sure you've heard it, many people have heard it, there's a quote that was found scratched into the wall of a German concentration camp in World War II. And it says, "I believe in the sun even when it's not shining. I believe in love even when I don't feel it. And I believe in God even when he's silent." And if you think of the context of where that person was when they scraped that into the stone wall of that concentration camp, over those years, God did appear silent, and he did appear a little non-responsive at times. And we had to wrestle with unanswered prayer and with disappointment. But somehow in the mystery, you know, this isn't scientific, it's a matter of the heart. And somehow in the mystery, he came close. He came close at times, enough to carry us through. And I think what we've begun to see, and your friend Chris Kane speaks well on this, and she said a few powerful, she's like the queen of the one-liners, isn't she? And she said a few things at the time that I really, you know, if she ever hears this, or if you're ever speaking to her, you can tell her these were so helpful. But she talked about God beckoning us in seasons of waiting, instead of burying us, that there's a beckoning, there's a wooing. And she talked as well about not being buried, but being planted. So the soil of the suffering that you're in, that God's waiting time and his waiting room is never wasted time. And those truths were foundational to our waiting. We began to change our conversation with God and with each other. And this is really important if you're waiting on God. I would say moving from the why to the what was fundamental. Not why me, why us, why this, though there is a very, very important place for lament and all of that. But then to transition to the what, Lord, are you doing? What would you want to achieve in us and through us in this season? What are you trying to say? What are you trying to grow? What are you trying to refine in us? And how would you use us for your glory in this season? And that's where it started to change, in the trenches of infertility. And that's where we begun to transition into a more fruitful season of suffering, if that doesn't sound too counterintuitive, rather than a really barren season of suffering. There was the exchange there.
Wow. Amazing, Sarah. That's just, it's very profound and Thank you so much for sharing so personally and so powerfully. Could you share a little bit about some of the sort of practical things that you did that enabled you to keep going? I remember you talking about Mother's Day in church in particular, but can you share some kind of practical things that people could, I guess, implement or borrow for themselves?
Yes, of
that
course.
helped?
Yeah, because sometimes you want to know flesh and bones what that looks like and how you actually function. I think practically as a couple, communication is really key on this. And you need to talk to either if you're in a couple and you're trying for children, then you need to talk to each other. Or if you're childless, not by choice through being single or perhaps being widowed or anything like that, whoever your sort of closest confidant and mentors and friends, trusted friends are, you want to acknowledge what is too hard and what sets you back in your healing and in your peace. Because those are the things you can put boundaries around. And actually, I read a little thing the other day online, and it said boundaries aren't about keeping people out. It's about keeping the peace of God in. And I really liked it.
That's
because
so good.
in times of pain and grief and sorrow, whatever that is, when the wheels are coming off, you do need to exercise some self-preservation and guard your hearts. And so what is it that is wounding? Now, there are triggers for those who are without children everywhere. You can't even have a duvet day on the sofa and eat a tub of Ben and Jerry's ice cream and watch telly because the triggers are on the telly. So it's really tricky. But I would say the things that we put in place, first of all, baby showers. Okay, so this is something that's kind of coming more over to the UK. I know it's very popular in America, but in the UK it is becoming more of a thing. And I went to baby showers. I tried baby showers, but there was one I went to. I love my friends and I wanted to love their children. There was one I went to where I had to sort of strap on a pregnant belly and play these stupid games and be frivolous. And I felt this tearing in my heart. I physically felt like almost like the structures, the fibers of my heart were being pulled. In fact, I'm, prone to a bit of drama. And I went up to the loo and I thought, I'm actually having a heart attack. I self-diagnosed. And I leaned against the wall. I know. And there was this tearing and I stayed and I braved and I played the games. But when I left, I vomited in the street. And then I cried for about 3 days and I couldn't leave the house. Now, this wasn't a regular occurrence for me, but I remember Andy saying, you can't go to baby showers anymore, darling. You can't do that. You're so kind to try, but you can't do that. So it was such a physiological response to the trauma and pain, and I just couldn't do it. And I loved my friends so much, and I wanted to love their babies. But I'll tell you what I did do. I stopped going to baby showers, but what I started to do was a friend advised me at the time to avoid a bitter root developing and any root of bitterness and jealousy, to be generous with my gift. Which I actually found almost as hard as going to the baby showers. So I would look at the gift list or I'd ask them what they needed and I would try to be really generous and buy something generous. And the harder the pregnancy announcement, which is a weird thing that only those in this situation will know. Some friends announce a pregnancy and you genuinely are overjoyed and it's wonderful. And others will announce it and it's nothing about the friend. It's just contextual or timing or I don't know. Yeah. It hurts way more. I'm not sure why. So the ones that hurt way more got a really way better present because I wanted to demonstrate something before the Lord, like an accountability. So baby showers, we drew a line up, but we also were generous with our giving. Mother's Day, let's just hit that one. I just didn't go, actually. Churches have moved on a lot, actually. Smart. They've changed. But at the time, and this is nothing against our leaders who were fabulous leaders, but at the time it maybe wasn't so talked about and thought about, not just for those with infertility, but those just maybe who lost children or who childless, as we say, not by choice or whatever the circumstances. But everyone was sort of asked to stand, like the mums were asked to stand, and they were gifted with daffodils. And I remember being seated, and I remember this shame. I felt like, in sport in America, they have those giant foam like fingers pointing, the ones. I felt like I had 45,000 over my head from the rafters pointing at the infertile one. And I felt so disgusting. And I just never went again. What I would say is I think churches have really moved on. But if Mother's Day is just way too triggering, just don't go. Darling, people go to the countryside, go for a weekend away, go for a nice walk, do something wonderful. It's fine. Where would Jesus be? Where would Jesus be in your suffering on those days? He'd be calling you to something beautiful and something that brings you life. And what I want to say is that our friends at Saltwater and Honey, which is a wonderful online blog and platform, it's 2 Anglican vicars and their wives who have got this wonderful platform which deals with infertility. But they've actually written, if you're a church leader listening to this, they've written a service called Mother's Day Runaways. And it is there's liturgy, there's prayers, there's plans, there's songs. And many churches affiliated with Saltwater and Honey have started holding these Mother's Day runaway services, usually on the Saturday night before Mother's Day, for people who do have difficult relationship with their own mothers, or who don't have children, or who've lost children. It's a really broad, it's not just infertility, it's just for those who can't hack being in church on Mother's Day. And that is a wonderful resource that I would really recommend. The other thing we did is generally with church, if you're a church goer, we used to always go to the morning service, just by default. We led youth in an evening and on a Saturday, and so our evenings were a little taken up with my shifts and things. So we tended to do church on Sunday morning. Now, in a lot of churches, that's a very family-oriented service. We did sort of sit away from like the pushchair zone and tried to find focus in the other side of the church. But one Sunday, and I will just be really honest about this, one Sunday we were asked to serve communion, which is always a joy and such a privilege and blessing. We love giving out communion. I always used to feel really grown up being asked to give out communion. Like even in my mid-30s, I was like, really?
I'm an adult.
Oh, wow. I know. I don't know why that is. I just used to be like, and also I'm quite sociable. I'm nosy and I love the opportunity to interact with so many people in church. But we got moved to the distribution center of the sort of baby zone, and I was sort of handing out the bread. Andy was doing the wine, and I was feeling absolutely fine, by the way. I was absolutely fine. And then bit by bit, babies in arms, gorgeous babies, pregnant bellies, pushchairs, the kids with the headphones, the slings. I don't know really what happened, but I became so overwhelmed with grief. And I was trying to administer communion. And in the end, I basically did a runner with the bread, by the way. So I caused an absolute problem. And I burst out of church through the fire doors and I wept. I cried years of tears, actually, that I probably should have cried already. And I broke my heart. And a dear friend had obviously clocked it. She followed me out. She took the bread back in to administer communion with Andy. And then she followed me up later. But actually, we stopped going to the morning service, not because it's not a beautiful place to be, but because it was not really helpful for me in meeting with the Lord. So we just switched to an evening service.
That makes
so there are just a few practical things as churchgoers that we did. And the final thing we did was we had rehearsed answers for difficult questions. And that's really helpful too.
Because people are so intrusive.
They are. And I think just to have, it sounds a bit false, but you will need it. I just think the odd rehearsed answer that you're confident to give when someone says, so any babies on the way? Or when are you going to have children? Or why have you got no children? Or don't you want children? Or, just to have a few rehearsed answers that you can give verbatim that won't make you crumple or make you feel very stuck are really helpful. And we had 3 or 4 for different contexts that we rolled out. So that's another thing you can do.
Oh, well done, Sue.
Sorry if you received one of those.
Publish that script.
Gladly.
Oh, that's amazing. What? So a couple more questions. What would you say to Christians about the sort of moral decisions related to infertility and seeking treatment? Sometimes it's it's not necessarily something people want to talk about publicly
No.
whilst they're processing it and thinking it through. And it's not necessarily something that people have thought about in advance of experiencing it. So you're so, you know, in the grief of the experience that you're in. So it can be hard to say, you know, what do I think about this?
Yeah.
Have you got any advice on safe ways to have the conversations about what you're comfortable with as a Christian with regard to sort of seeking treatment?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say, and we'll obviously come back to you mentioned it in my intro about the Rhythm of Hope Day, but at the Rhythm of Hope retreat day / conference, we actually we dedicate a whole session to this, and we have sort of an in-house theologian and Christian ethicist help us unpack this, because it's a huge topic. So I never feel I can do it justice without him kind of alongside me. But to sort of, it's such an important point, and I'm really grateful you would ask the question. I think it's a huge topic, obviously, and as I say, I can't do it wonderful justice, but a few things I would say. Yes, of course, in many cases where a couple are experiencing infertility for a medical reason, or even couples who haven't been given a diagnosis but are given the choice of pursuing fertility treatment, and indeed single people who pursue fertility treatment to have a baby, then with that comes a whole host of just things to consider, particularly as a Christian, but also as a human being. I would love to say that fertility treatments are a choice, you know, if you're offered them. For some couples, it's not an option, sadly, for whatever reason. But if you are given that option, it is still a choice. It's not an obligation. So please feel very free if in all your searching and seeking and praying that you discern this is not right for you. That's okay. It's not that you're trying any less or you haven't tried everything. If you don't have a peace about pursuing it, that's really, really okay to not pursue it. However, it's a very personal experience, couple to couple. And whilst we would seek for guidance from the Bible, clearly medicine and science have come a long way since the Bible was written, and there's not a lot of sort of the documented advice you would so desire in this situation. So I think when Christians pursue this, it comes with a degree of moral, ethical, and spiritual responsibility that is unique to each couple. And what's really important as a couple or as an individual pursuing this route is that you start to ask yourself and explore some of the bigger questions that will then influence your decision making. Questions that you may not have asked yourself before, but that are really important. So, for example, I have written some of these down so I'm accurate, but you need to start to think about when do you believe that life begins? Because when you have reached a conclusion on that or sought some wisdom on that for yourself between you and the Lord, when does life begin? And I've heard Christians give many different answers to this, all of which are, you know, plausible and interesting to an extent. But there are different thoughts on this. But what you conclude on that will go on to influence your decision making on, for example, in IVF, how many eggs you might agree to have fertilized. Or what would you do with surplus embryos? So if you're not aware, in the process of IVF and assisted sort of conception, generally clinics want to maximize the chances of success by fertilizing as many eggs as possible, okay, because it increases the chance of success to have a viable embryo. And when you get that scenario, you have sometimes a lot of embryos, which can clearly go on to lead to being transferred into the womb and to a pregnancy. So for us, I'm going to be really honest with you, the way we made decisions when we were trying some fertility, assisted fertility treatment, we said, how many children would we be willing to have should this be beautifully successful? How many children could we have in our home, in our car, financially, that we could provide for? What's our capacity? Once we decided what our number of children was, we made a really unpopular decision that is how many eggs we would have fertilized. Because we knew that
That's
we
so good. So I mean,
personally.
I've heard others say that. Yeah.
Now, look,
really
I have wonderful, godly, beautiful friends who have discerned this in other ways, okay, who've had surplus embryos, who've fertilized loads of eggs. And I am not saying that's wrong. It was wrong for us because I would not, the way Andy and I are wired, if I had a bunch of embryos in a lab, they're all my babies, right? It's just how I'm wired. And if I had like 36 babies in a lab, I would be wanting them all, right? And we can't. And so, but other couples in a godly and discerning way who've had surplus embryos have actually pursued there's embryo adoption. So couples who can't conceive, who can adopt an embryo that is left over from a treatment and have it put in their womb, and that is their baby. It's the adoption process, but from pregnancy. Now, we have godly and wonderful couples who've given their embryos for that, because that they felt the Lord was guiding them to do that. So there's just very unique. I want to tread gently because this is very personal and it's not legalistic. But what I would say is, in informing yourselves on your views on these things, it's really important. The other thing, if donor conception is what is on the table for you, so you needed a donor egg or a donor sperm, explore what your views are on the marital covenant, on how you feel about a third party kind of coming into your story. I've heard couples express worries about, well, is it like committing adultery? You have to explore these really sticky and tricky questions. Our theologian in-house did say very helpfully, there's no sexual gratification involved with that process. And so I think you don't need to worry about the adultery side of things. But, these things need to be explored. He also pointed out, for discussion, not saying, I'm just throwing it out there, that to all intent and purpose, Jesus was a surrogate, in that Mary carried Jesus by this miraculous way. Things are complicated and they need discerning. And I think they need to be done between you and the Lord and with a good advisor. It's all part of a bigger conversation, but really what we landed on, and as a team at the Rhythm of Hope, what we try to steer couples in this very personal sort of topic area, is that a lot of this comes down to motives of the heart. This is where we've landed, is that we are judged by God on the motives of our heart. And if your motives for growing your family and for pursuing a treatment option are before the Lord, and you've prayed and you've discerned and you've offered it to him, and you're going forward with a peace, you just put one's foot in front of the other. I think if you lose peace in the process, I would always say you pull back. And if you're in a couple pursuing fertility treatment, Andy and I's advice was always, if you aren't one on the decision, you don't proceed. So part of the reason we took 13 years to get to where we got to is because for about 12 years, we weren't one on things. So I might hit a stage of like, I really think we should take this route. And Andy'd be like, I'm not feeling peace about that. And then he'd come back to me and be like, darling, I've really prayed about that. And I think you're right. I think we should do that. And I'd be like, I've actually lost my peace on that one now, Anne, so we can't proceed, And so it went on. It went on for so long, but you need to be united as a couple first and foremost. And it all comes back to the motives of the heart, with the information made available to you at the time. And hindsight is a wonderful thing. You want to make decisions you can live with in the future, but you have to be kind and gracious to yourself, just as the Lord is so gracious to us. There are certain things I look back on and think, I wish that had been different. But in exploring that with Andy and before the Lord, he's like, you didn't have the information available to you at the time to make an informed decision, a different informed decision. You were going on what we had at the time. And I think that's where it comes down to where our hearts were pointed before the Lord. So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't mean to be fluffy.
That's so helpful,
Sarah. But I'm not going to be prescriptive because I can't.
No, that's good. Can you share a bit about the Rhythm of Hope for our listeners, why you started it, what the day is like? And sidebar, I have recommended it to so many people.
Oh, thank you.
And often, just under the radar, like and then people, and I realized sort of 5 years later, they weren't.
Oh,
But
thank you. Yeah.
it's such a rare and unique space to have a safe space, a totally confidential space where people don't know that, publicly that you're there. You really guard people's privacy.
Oh yeah, totally.
I don't think there's anything else out there like it. But just share what the Rhythm of Hope is, when it is, how people can book on.
Yeah. So we occupy a really small corner of the universe, but it's one that needs occupying. So when Andy and I were in the very depths of our own journey, part of the problem was at the time there was very little out there, particularly in the UK for Christians. And there was quite a bit sort of on a secular basis, but not much in the UK from a Christian perspective. And so I was actually at a conference and I heard someone preaching for the very first time on the topic of infertility. It was Dawn Sherry Wilkinson, actually. And she spoke from this enormous platform from the trenches of infertility. She was speaking about her own journey and she hadn't yet got an outcome. Well, this was revolutionary to me. I'd only ever heard people speak or preach on these things from the other side with it all wrapped up in a neat bow. And whilst Andy and I had always thought we would use our story in some way to encourage others, we thought it would be after we had our resolution. But the Lord really impressed on me, I want you to do this from the messy middle, from the trenches, from the unknown and from the unresolved. It was a double whammy for me, because I knew the Lord had spoken to me, and once I told Andy I had accountability on it. But secondly, I remember we were walking in Cornwall and I told him, and I was so scared to tell him because I knew he'd hold me to it. But secondly, we'd actually kept it really private. Only I would say not even on one hand could you count the people who knew. So this would then be going public with our most private part of our life, which the thought of it was horrendous. But we basically set up something called the Rhythm of Hope, a little bit taken from that scripture from the message about the unforced rhythms of grace. But we were looking at getting into a rhythm of hope. And as I said before, not hope for a baby, but hope in our future and hope in Jesus. That's what it means, the rhythm of hope, getting into a daily sort of way of walking, talking, breathing that brings hope into our futures. And we basically, quite selfishly, but prompted by the Lord, set up an event that we wanted to attend. It was something that was lacking in our lives. We booked the speakers, we decided on the topics, we chose the worship leaders who we knew would bless and encourage us and equip us. And then we just hoped others would come, It's a very small event. I think we take, like 150 people. It's quite deliberate. We want the room to be full enough that you don't feel exposed, but big enough that full enough that you don't feel exposed, but small enough that you feel seen and that it's personal, if that could make sense. And it's in we wanted a beautiful location in the Oxfordshire countryside. We wanted delicious food. That was really important, to eat really nice, comforting food, home cooked. And then to tackle heart, mind and soul, really. So it's a long day. It's 9 till 9 because we only have our amazing team for one day. So we just cram it all in. But most of the couples coming make a weekend away of it. And we worship. And then we look at head and heart. We look at theological, ethical, moral stuff. We look at unanswered prayer and disappointment with God. We look at marriage. We look at mental health. Lots of things. And the aim is, I guess our sort of mandate is to encourage and equip Christians who are experiencing infertility, both primary and secondary. Couples may have had a baby, but be able to have no more. They're still walking the road of secondary infertility. We had to narrow it down to Christian couples experiencing infertility because we felt that was our experience and we could tailor it much more personally than to perhaps those who are childless, not by choice through singleness or by being widowed or who've lost children, because they are very important and niche topics within their own realm. And I really hope something is created for those. But for now, this seeks to equip and encourage those couples. So we meet with, there is no group work at all. There is no share your story. There are no name stickers, all the things I loathe about Christian settings. You will not have to wear a name sticker. Even the food, you have choices all day. You can come and speak to no one, or you can come and meet with anyone for companionship and friendship and support. We have a networking team who'll link you to people if you want. We have a team who will let you be on your own if you want. Even all the meals come in the option of a very sturdy wooden box that you can eat in your car, in the car park, if you don't want to literally sit with anybody. Such is the discretion, and such is the sensitivity of the day. We want it to be comfortable. We want everyone to feel comfortable, because booking on and
safe.
Coming safe. And I will tell you, and you've been, Amy, you were our guest last year, there are tears, but there is also a lot of laughter. It's this beautiful mix, and everyone in the room has experienced this. And our team are scrupulously selected, and we're fussy to the max with who's in that building and who's given a voice. A very popular part of the day is our sofa couples in the afternoon. We spend 3 hours interviewing about 10 couples whilst eating nice homemade cakes and drinking drinks, but about how they've grown their family. And we try to leave no stone left unturned. So we look at donor conception, we look at adoption, we look at fostering, we look at surrogacy, we look at sort of assisted fertility treatments like IVF. Well. We look at all of it. We look at remaining childless, choosing to stop, and remaining childless. We really give time and voice to that, because it's so important for some couples to have the permission to start to dream of a future in a different way. So that's the day. It's held in January every year. It's deliberately in January because January was our darkest month. So we used to find the end of one year without a baby and the start of another totally heartbreaking and overwhelming. And January can be a bit grim anyway, post-Christmas and everything. So we wanted it to be a day of hope and vision for the year ahead for the couples. And this year it's on January the 18th. And you can just find all the details on therhythmofhope.co.uk.
Rhythmofhope.co.uk.
Yeah, or on our Instagram as well.
Lang. Yes, follow their Instagram too. If this is in any way connecting, which I know it will be for so many people. Sarah Lang, thank you so much. Sorry I've kept you for so long, but it's been spellbinding.
It's my joy and pleasure.
Amazing.
And it's hard to gloss over these things.
Joining.
No,
we've needed to give it the space and time. So thank you so much to Sarah Lang from The Rhythm of Hope for joining me today on the Lead podcast. You'll be able to find in the show notes that connection to that study that Sarah mentioned, and we'll put the website up as well. If you're watching this from the US, or listening to this from around the world, I still recommend The Rhythm of Hope. It would be worth coming to the beautiful Oxfordshire countryside for that day, because it really is a very special and unique event. So check that out if you need it. Thank you too for listening to us and sticking with us for this rather long but brilliant podcast. Can I ask you, if you're enjoying the podcast, to do me the huge favour of leaving a 5-star review following the show, and maybe sharing it with someone else that you know will find this really helpful. Thank you so much for listening to the Lead podcast with me, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, and join us next week for another conversation. Thank you.